Good morning. I'm Tamara Shoemaker. I'm back in Joshua this morning. Had a nice little sidetrack into the story of David and Goliath the other day, and I thought that was really cool because I got through the praxis. If you haven't seen my Facebook page, conquered that giant on the first try with the first stone, and it was awesome, and all praise and glory to God because he was the one who fought my battle for me. All right, so moving on, we're back in Joshua again. And we're back in a really hard chapter. It's a really tough one. So I'm going to tackle it. We'll see how it goes. Once when I was in elementary school, I forget which grade, the teacher had to go down the hall for just a second. And she didn't have a teaching assistant, so she left us alone for a couple of minutes. She gave us the typical stringent instructions, behave, I'm going to be right back, and you guys need to be quiet. And then she left 25 children to their own devices. It was a very short amount of time, but it was it was an alone time. So how much trouble could we have gotten in, really, in that short amount of time? Turns out our class was fairly capable of exceeding expectations where that was concerned. It quickly got loud, and I remember a projectile getting launched across the classroom. I think it might have been a spitball, maybe, I can't remember. But anyway, and then another and another. And it was pretty soon, it was just like this war of flying things. And before we knew it, our class was yelling across the room at each other, taking sides, throwing things. The thing was, the commotion had been started by a few people. And then it was carried on by those same few people. Most of us sat quietly in our seats, right? We were determined to obey what the teacher had said. And a couple of the obedient kids had tried to restore order. You guys were going to get in trouble, those kids. And some were like, shh. So anyway, in about 2 minutes, we heard the sharp tapping of our teacher's shoes on the tile floor in the hall outside our classroom. And her angry face reappeared. Her hand switched off the lights, and immediate silence descended. She was furious, and she lit into us. And I remember in particular one thing that she said. She said, "I had a conversation the other day with another teacher who asked me which students I had. And when I told him, he said, 'Oh, you have the bad class.' Do you have any idea how that made me, your teacher, feel? Do you know that you have the reputation of being the bad class? Do you really want to be known as that?" So in elementary school, I was the stereotypical shy flower, goody two-shoes who never, ever, ever, ever made waves. So this little barb stuck deep in my heart. I was a part of the bad class. I was at fault. So even though I had not ever got to the point, where I had ever stepped a toe out of line at school, I was to blame for being a part of that class. So we all missed recess that day, the best part of the day. We all missed it. We all spent that recess period with our heads down on our desks, and the lights were out as the teacher sat at her desk and did her work. And I can almost hear you thinking, it's not fair, because I know that's what I was thinking. It wasn't fair. You're right, it wasn't fair. But because of our collective identity as that class who had misbehaved, we were all punished. So my little story, it's not a perfect parallel for what I'm going to talk about today. I wrote about it on the blog. I'm going to talk about it here today, but it's going to kind of get you there on the general track. Excuse me. Here we are in Joshua 7, where Joshua and the nation of Israel have just conquered their first city west of the Jordan River. It's the first stop on a campaign trail to take the entire land of Canaan, which is their promised land the Lord has given to them or has promised to them. Because the Israelites are the covenant people of God, they have this collective identity. We will take this land in the name of the God of Israel. We are the fulfillment of his promise. And the people of Canaan, they know this. They know that there's this incoming surge of people who isn't necessarily a scattered ragtag group of nations or even a single nation with varying loyalties. They are one people and they have one God, the God of Israel. And so as it's mentioned several times in the first 6 chapters of Joshua, the people's hearts, the people of Canaan's hearts, are melting in fear because of the Israelites, because the Israelites are the chosen people of God. So before the Israelites marched around Jericho's thick walls on the 7th and the last day of Joshua chapter 6, Joshua gives these instructions to the Israelites. He says, "The city and all that are in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies that we sent. but keep away from the devoted things so that you will not bring about your own destruction and bring trouble on it. So that you will not bring about your own destructions by taking any of them. Otherwise, you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury. That's Joshua 6:17-19. So devoted things in this context are things not to be pursued for individual gain. They are set aside, they are devoted to God and to no one else, so the taking of devoted things, in this instance, is stealing from the Lord. So, unbeknownst to anyone except the Lord, as a ransack of Jericho is occurring, there is one man, his name is Achan, who eyes this beautiful Babylonian cloak. He sees a wedge of gold, he sees some silver. He looks around, sees that no physical eyes are looking at him, and he takes those things. He carries them to his tent. He buries them in the ground beneath his tent so that nobody will ever know. But the Lord knows, and he's not having it. More on that in a second. The Israelites finished conquering Jericho, right? They put aside the devoted things for the Lord, and they planned for their next campaign, which is an attack on a small city called Ai. Scouting it out, they realized that there are very few fighting men in the city of Ai. So rather than creating a massive entrenchment around this small city with their whole army, they just send 3,000 fighting men to, take it out. So the Israelites approach the city. They're comfortable in their knowledge that God has given them this land and the city's in it. They're strong. They're confident. Haven't they just routed Jericho? And they've done so in the name of the Lord by only marching around it. God has shown his power and his might, and he will again here too, right? So they approach the city gates. They're ready to fight. And then the whole thing falls apart. The scriptures don't say exactly what happened, except that the men of Ai chased the Israelites from the city gate as far as the stone quarries and struck them down on the slopes. So while Israel only lost 36 men of their 3,000, their hearts melted and they became like water. Fear disrupts trust, right? Turns it inside out. The Israelites had trusted that God would give them this land, and then they were routed. You can almost hear them asking, what just happened? You can feel the whys coming out of this passage, right? We are your chosen people, God. You promised us this land. What happened? Why did you do this? So Joshua 7:6 says, Then Joshua tore his clothes and fell face down to the ground before the ark of the Lord, remaining there until evening. The elders of Israel did the same, and they sprinkled dust on their heads. Penitent, Joshua takes his why before the Lord. And I think that it's significant that God does not give him an answer right away, right? He doesn't give him an immediate response. Joshua doesn't get his response until evening. Heads down on the desks in that dark room that we had for our class, we had a chance to thoroughly consider sin and consequences. Joshua and the elders have a chance to thoroughly consider sin and consequences. Joshua doesn't yet know what's gone wrong, and obviously something has. And he's got to spend some purposeful time laying his heart out before the Lord and taking inventory of what's in it. So here's something that came out of this for me. God's chosen people, God's covenant people, are a part of his promise. Since the Canaanites know this and their hearts are melting in fear because of this, God has a reputation on the line. Joshua pulls this out when he prays in chapter 7, verses 8 and 9. O Lord, what can I say now that Israel has been routed by its enemies? The Canaanites and the other people of the country will hear about this, and they will surround us and wipe out our name from the earth. What then will you do for your own great name? So God answers Joshua. First, he tells Joshua, who has not sinned, by the way, he says, Stand up, what are you doing on your face? Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant, which I commanded them to keep. God doesn't call out Achan individually yet. He names Israel, his people, the whole collective group of them. They have violated my covenant. So even though Joshua hasn't sinned, nor thousands and thousands of Israelites, all of them are a part of the loss to Ai because of the sin of a single tiny little cog of this great machine, right? And even though Joshua is a great and God-fearing leader of God's chosen people, since he's a part of this machine with the faulty cog, he gets to experience the same awful realities that come with the sin of someone else. None of this is going to be fixed until the problem is rooted out. So the Lord shows Joshua who has taken the devoted things, God's things, for himself. And it's a slow, intense process. It reminds me of those nesting dolls, right? You have to keep opening each one to get to the smaller one inside. So likely using the Urim and the Thummim from Exodus 28:30 that it talks about that the high priest had. So probably using those, the tribe of Judah is brought forward and named as the guilty party. Then within the tribe of Judah, the clan of the Zerahites is brought forward. And then within the clan of the Zerahites, the family of Zimri comes forward. And then within the family of Zimri, each man of that family presents himself, and Achan is found to be the guilty one. So Achan confesses to what he did. He tells Joshua that he hid the devoted things, and Joshua sends men to make sure that what he says is true. The messengers bring out the cloak and the gold and the silver, and they spread them out before the Lord. And this brings up the really difficult part, and I hate reading about it. I mean, really, I do. Because of Achan's choice, because of his sin, he and his family and all his livestock and his animals are all stoned to death, and they're all burned with his possessions. So it's this collective identity that is really hard for me to grasp, but it's the nature of this covenant between God and an entire group of people. Because Achan sinned, he brought dishonor, a tarnished reputation on the name of God's people and on God himself. It's not only himself that he's harming, right? It's a whole people group, and it has serious consequences. So the punishment, in turnabout fashion, does not only affect Achan, but it affects Achan's whole family because of their collective identity. I spent some time this morning asking God, the same God who did not turn from his fierce anger until Achan had paid the price, where was your famous grace in this story? So he showed me a picture in response, a beautiful field with rows and rows and rows and rows of green sprouting plants, right? And as I watched, there was this flood. Water washed over the field, covered not only one plant, not two plants, but a multitude of plants. And I was dismayed because the plants were going to die if they were kept under the water. The ground, thirsty as it often is, slowly began to saturate the water, but it was taking way too long for my internal time clock, right? And then I heard this word. My blessing is for the whole field. Blessing? And this is where I had a slight perspective shift. That the flood, in my eyes, seemed to be devastating to the plants, certainly not a blessing. But the plants actually needed that water to thrive. So while the water came all at once, and while it seemed deadly, the plants actually needed it, though I couldn't see it at first. So in the larger picture, Achan's sin was like a splinter that needed to be rooted out in order to keep the infection from growing and spreading. And taken in that light, the rooting out was a blessing, but still, so hard to read about. So this story makes me intensely grateful for the truly amazing grace that tore the temple veil in two and brought salvation to each person on their own individually, presented before the Lord beneath the blood of the Lamb who paid the redemptive price once and for all. No longer collectively identified by our part in a sinful people group or required to pay the price along with those who are also identified in that people group. The only identity that we now carry, if we choose, is bought, redeemed, ransomed. Amazing grace. Isaiah 53:6 says, we all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him, on Jesus, his Son, the iniquity of us all. It's a great promise. I'll see you tomorrow.